Well, obviously these are vintage frets. They're gonna be too small for Ricky. Yeah. Hello, Officer Tony here. In today's episode, Ricky is gonna take a look at this neck and he's gonna decide what to do. I can almost guarantee you he ain't gonna like them tiny, tiny frets. But we'll see. Let's find out.
Hello, Richard from budgetguitarist.com. Today, we're going to look at the neck. So this is part of my series for the StewMac T-style guitar kit. None of these companies can say Telecaster style because Telecaster is copyrighted by Fender. What happens if I say Telecaster style kit instead of T-style? Are the Fender lawyers going to show up at my door? If they do, can I invite them in here and say, look, I have Fender posters, I have a Fender clock. I'm a big fan. I have a Fender Strat, I have a Fender Telecaster. I have several Squier instruments. Never mind. Okay, so let's have a look at this guy. I can already tell, I'm almost positive this right here is a plastic nut. That's gonna have to go. And more importantly, these frets. So let's talk about these frets. This guy right here, I refretted using Fender medium jumbo frets. And this is a good fret height for me. I like jumbo frets. I like medium jumbo. Less than that, I'm not too crazy about it. Now, why? So it really just depends on the kind of player you are, trying to decide like what frets are for you. If you are like a speed metal guy, you do not want these because what you want to do is barely press down on the string, make contact with the fret and be done with it. You don't want to have to force, like apply a lot of force because it's going to slow you down. On the other hand, if you play jazz, where you're not doing a lot of bending, then you might particularly like a lower fret. Back in the 50s, Strats and Telecasters were made with small frets like this. You can kind of see. I don't know, can you see the difference just me holding them up? You kind of can. See how the Epiphone frets are wider? They also happen to be taller. The advantage of a taller fret is you don't have to apply quite as much pressure on the string in order to get the note, and so you can play faster on it. It's also easier to bend. The disadvantage is if you apply too much pressure, you will knock the note out of tune. The other disadvantage is if you're sliding around with your finger on the frets, then it's like speed bumps. Whereas on a lower fret, as you slide your finger around, it's like mini speed bumps. So you just have to kind of play a bunch of different fret sizes and decide what you like. I know I like medium jumbo. I also like jumbo. I'm not crazy about vintage, and that's what these are. So these frets are going to have to go. In addition to that, the plastic nut has to go. And then what else do we have to do? The wood is raw and unfinished on this guy right here. It's just raw. Let's go ahead and begin. This guy has to come out. Now, the worst thing you could do to try to remove one of these things is to take a screwdriver in there and just start pounding on it like hammer chisel style, because what can happen is this wood right here where my finger is tapping, that can actually break off if you're not careful. That can also break off if you're trying to like put a little bit of pressure on the nut from one end, like trying to hammer it down so that it comes out. See, at the factory, they probably put some glue down, usually 1 or 2 dots, enough to hold it in. In some cases, it's in there so hard that you have to actually take like a skinny little hacksaw blade and cut the thing in half and then bust it and remove it. I don't believe that's going to be necessary with this guy. This is basically for cutting frets. It's a fret cutter. So when you put new frets on, it's basically for trimming the edge off of the fret. And it's kind of cool because it's totally flat at the very top of it. And so you can get right up flush to any surface with this. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to attempt to slowly and carefully remove the nut using my fret cutters here. Alrighty. And I'm just going to squeeze it, give it a good squeeze, and just slowly kind of work it like this. I'm just working it real slowly to get it out. I'm not in a hurry because I don't want to rip up whatever the glue is glued to. I don't want to tear out that wood. I want to do this as easily as possible, and I can hear the glue breaking. You probably can't. And there we go. So this would be plastic. Kind of interesting. If you look at this guy, it is totally flat. Usually on fender nuts on a Telecaster or a Strat, they have a small curve to the bottom which follows the curve of the neck, which makes me suspect something. I suspect standard Telecaster, Stratocaster has a 9.5-inch radius. So I have these radius guides that actually came in one of those how to work on your guitar StewMac books. Like you pop them out of the back. A professional shop would have metal versions of these, but this is what I got. So here's 9.5. Let's see if we can figure out what the radius is on this guy. I'm betting it is definitely not 9.5. I don't know if you can tell, but there's a space underneath there. This is definitely not a 9.5-inch radius. Is it a 12? Yes. I would say this is a 12-inch radius board. That's great if you're like a metal player, 12 or 14. I'm not a metal player. So in addition to pulling all these frets up, I'm going to re-radius the board, which means that I'm going to give it a curve approximately like that. So step 1 is going to be removing the fret. Well, step 1 was remove the nut. Step 2, remove the frets. Then I'm going to re-radius the board. And then after that, I'm going to round these edges because they're super hard, super harsh. Then I will put the new frets in. I'll put a new nut in, and I'll cut the nut slots. You know, I'll set the nut up the way it needs to be, and then we'll be in good shape with the exception of this guy. I'm still going to have to figure out how I want to cut off the excess here. The other thing that I did already that I didn't show on camera is I just checked the truss rod to make sure that it turned and that it turned easily and it turned in both directions, and it does. So good thing to know. There is, you can see there, that's a good angle right there. See the glue underneath there that was originally gluing in that cheap plastic nut? I'm gonna have to clean that out when it comes time to do the nut. Okay, to pull frets, this guy's too big. So we have another specialized tool for that, and look, it's like a miniature version. It's like the little bitty brother. So there's 2 ways to do this. One way to do it is where you use a soldering iron and you heat up the fret, heat up the metal. If there's any glue underneath, it will cause the glue to soften, and it can also loosen up the wood fibers a little bit and make it easier to pull. I'm not sure if I need to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start at the very top and just try one and see what happens. Something that is really important to know about doing fret work, and that is this. When you do a refret, it is impossible, just about, to pull the frets out so cleanly that none of the wood comes out. It's not possible. Now, we're lucky in the sense that I'm going to be replacing these with bigger frets, which I happen to have right here, from Sam Ash. $10.99. These are medium jumbo frets. Anyway, they're wider. And so if there's a little bit of tear out from the wood here, this should help to cover some of that tear out. Let's just do one and see what happens. So, another thing. I can almost guarantee you there's no glue underneath these frets. Like PRS glues in their frets. Some really high-end company glue in their frets because they say it makes for a better bond, and so you get better sustain. It's an expensive thing to do, it's time-consuming, and I can almost guarantee you there's no glue in these slots, but let's find out. So basically what I'm doing is I'm just putting this down flush, I'm starting on one end, I'm applying downward pressure, and I'm squeezing a little bit, and then I'm kind of doing what I did on the nut here. Now, as I'm doing this, it's going to tear up the fret, like the top of the fret, but I don't care because we're not going to reuse these. Let's just see what we can do here. I can feel it starting to come out. Slowly. Patience is the name of the game. Let me stop there for a second so you can see the kind of start I've got. See? So that'll make it easier to do the rest. What you don't want to do is just yank it out, because then you will rip up the fretboard on both sides. You want to do this as carefully as possible. Don't worry, I'm not going to film every single fret that I'm pulling out. I just wanted to show you one so you could see the process. And we are almost done. And we are done. Okay. Now, let me hold this up so you can really see it. That is, if I do say so myself, practically perfect. That fret came up really cleanly. I didn't tear up the fretboard at all. That makes me really optimistic for doing this. I'd be very surprised if they all came up that easily, but there you go. Okay, so I'm going to pause the camera and I'm going to do the rest of them, and then we'll see what it looks like after that. Okay, all done. Now, just as I promised, there are some spots on here which I'm going to point out to you. I mean, this is still really clean, but yeah, you can see there a little bit, like in through here. So you can see kind of where the board chipped a little bit. So I went slow. I did a pretty good job. It looks pretty good. A lot of that stuff is going to be hidden by the new frets. And again, I want to emphasize this 100 million times, but if you do a refret, this will happen. Now, StewMac does make this metal kind of like thing that you put both sides of it go between the fret, and it's supposed to help with this stuff when you pull them out. I used one once and I didn't see much of a difference myself. Also interesting, I want to show you something. When I took out the second fret, something happened that's never happened to me before. The metal from these frets is so cheap, it started to flake, and I actually got a little metal sliver in my hand. And so that's why I decided to put the glove on to do the rest of them. Because, let's see if you can see any of this. You can see some of that down there, like in this area. Some of that's wood, but some of that's metal. These are extremely cheap frets. Like, I've never had this happen before. So, there's another reason I'm glad I'm replacing them. And then another thing that I thought was really interesting, I do this too. When they put the fret in, see if I can hold this up. Okay, see at the end of the fret where it's kind of like clipped? So this is the top edge of the fret. And then this bottom edge with the notches in it, that's what goes into the wood. And at the very edge of it, they've cut away some of these tangs, these fret tangs. They cut it away. And then what they end up doing is it leaves a little bit of a hole here. And so you can definitely still see this. They fill the hole, right, with basically the equivalent of sawdust and super glue. That's what that stuff is. That's what I'm going to be doing when I refret this instrument. I'm going to be doing the exact same thing. But I'm using a much higher quality fret wire, and it's not going to end up like fragmenting little metal slivers all over the place. But this is really important though. If you're going to do this, you get a kit like this or any other kit and you're pulling the frets, be careful of that so that you don't end up with a little piece of metal in your finger like I did. And again, that's never happened. Anytime I pull frets out of like a Fender or even a Squire, I've never had that happen to me, but it certainly happened with these guys. Right, okay. So the next step for this is I'm going to take it outside, and I have a radius sanding block, and I'm going to re-radius this board because it is way, way, way too flat for me. So that's next. Also, these frets right here, these Fender frets, are pre-radius for 9.5. You can kind of see a little bit, they're pre-bent ever so slightly with a 9.5 inch radius, which looks roughly like this. I'm actually going to do a little bit of filming outside for that. Filming, listen to me, there's no film. Video recording outside for that because you don't want to be breathing in wood dust, and you certainly don't want to sand indoors. So that's next. I am outside in my neighborhood. We got dogs and kids and horns and all kinds of stuff. You can see what I'm doing here. I'm using the Charbroil workbench outside. So this is a radius block, 9.5 inches. I've used some double-sided tape and some 220 grit sandpaper. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sand this way, try to keep a straight line, and I'm going to put a 9.5-inch radius on this. If you are wondering why there's white paper under here, it's because, assuming the wind doesn't blow it away, I want to gather this sawdust from this board because I can use it to fill spots later. The wood is coming off. You can see it's coming off here and here, but not yet in the center. When I start to see it come off the center, then I know that I'm where I need to be. Right now, I'm just taking some off the edges because this was so flat. It's becoming apparent to me that there's a little bit of a compound radius on this board, or there was. See the pattern? Not a big fan of compound radiuses, though, personally, because to me it makes the fretwork way more complicated. But I'm also fairly inexperienced, so maybe one day I'll be better at it. And you might say, wouldn't it be a better idea to clamp it? Well, yeah, it would, but I don't have a clamp. I think I might be done. I'm going to check it. Oh, yeah. Yeah, can't tell on camera, but it looks really good. This is now 9.5. And all of this dust is super important because I can use it, I can reuse it, use it to fill holes. So check it out. See all this? That's what I was able to reclaim, and it's the same color. The wood dust is the same color as this wood because that's what it came from. So here's the thing. If in this whole process I lose a little bit of wood from any spot on here, I can combine this with water-thin super glue and patch the hole, and it'll look good. What I didn't show on camera is I took the edge off of this a little bit. And to do that, basically I just sanded like this, kind of like that. So I knocked down the edge on here. I'm going to be doing that some more once the frets are in.